thank you very much for still putting up with me, saying something. First of all, I want to make a few remarks about this particular painting. Is my most favorite representation of Christ. That's the reason I have it here. Pantocrator. This is from the 6th century in the St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt. Some of you, if you haven't been there ever, I actually recommend you to go there sometime. This has extraordinary paintings. In fact, sometimes I think if some of those paintings were sold in the open market in New York, it would be billions of dollars worth. It's absolutely extraordinary paintings, and hundreds of them. That is the oldest surviving Christian monastery.
Where is this, Robbie?
In Egypt.
And what's the name of it?
St. Catherine's Monastery. And in southern Egypt, this is where Moses saw the burning bush. That is part of the monastery. Actually, it begins from there. That's where, from where you then, if you're interested, you try to go up to Mount Sinai. You can walk up, but after a certain time, it becomes harder and harder. So you may want to ride a camel. But I highly recommend that. And also, this is where you all know this background. Moses is, strictly speaking, running away from the law, having killed an Egyptian soldier. Then he sees this burning bush and he hears this voice, "Go ask the Pharaoh to let my people go." Now, as I said, he's running away from the law. If he goes back to the Pharaoh, he'll be arrested and possibly killed. So this is where then he says, "Who should I say has sent me?" This is the first time the word Yahweh is used in the Bible. And then, because even the Torah was read under the Roman Empire, actually in Greek for almost 100 years, Yahweh was translated as I am. So in English you would read that, "Go tell the Pharaoh that I am has sent you." That's the overall. So I am then becomes more or less, for example, again it may be helpful for some of you to know, what is called Jesus in English, his name is actually Joshua, coming from Yehoshua, which literally means Yahweh saves. So when he says, for example, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," what he's actually saying, I am is the way, the truth, and the life. In fact, I was so surprised when I was writing my commentary on John's Gospel, how come many Christian scholars don't speak about it? Then I discovered at least one scholar who actually does say exactly what I just said. Christ's remark is not, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." It is actually, "I am is the way, the truth, and the life." And the very word Joshua, which comes from Yehoshua, literally means Yahweh saves. That's the literal meaning of it in Hebrew. So some of these backgrounds I'm just mentioning to you this is helpful for people, especially most of you have grown up in the Judeo-Christian tradition here. And I highly recommend to visit this monastery. There I was also shown something. It's actually, they have framed it and put it on the wall, more or less a letter, or really a commandment by Prophet Muhammad to all the Muslims, that even though they may end up fighting with the Christians, which of course, as you know, historically there were many fights, but they were forbidden never to attack a monastery, a Christian monastery. And I actually then tried to do a little survey on this. As far as I know, they have never attacked the Christian monastery. They may have done many other damages. And then on Mount Athos, in one of the Christian monasteries there, one of the monks said to me, "Even if we are attacked by the Muslims, we can bear this because they are not going to really destroy the monasteries according to the commandment. But we certainly don't want the Catholics to come here." I was so surprised by this. Division within the Christian tradition are much stronger than between different religions.
Where in Egypt?
Say that again?
Can I ask where in Egypt this monastery is?
Right now I'm forgetting the name of the town, but it's southern part of Egypt, more or less really bordering Israel. And this is where the burning bush, you can easily look it up where the burning bush is.
Mount Sinai would be
Pardon?
If she looked up Mount Sinai.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
would-
you'll find it easily. And as I said, it's the oldest surviving monastery in the Christian tradition. First of all, again, some of these remarks I have made many times, but a few of you are new here, so don't mind repeating them. The word used for love in early Greek language is eros. But by the time of the New Testament, the word eros is more or less diluted a little, or denuded in its importance, and it's replaced either by agape or by philia. Philia is sometimes written also with an F-I-L-I-A or P-H-I-L-I-A. So you'll find two different ways of writing it. But another thing I want to mention here slightly, because we'll be speaking about bhakti in the Hindu tradition tomorrow. Bhakti has a built-in hierarchy, by which I mean, for example, Arjuna, disciple of Krishna, can have bhakti for Krishna. It's not that Krishna has bhakti for Arjuna. There's completely a built-in hierarchy in it. Whereas the word agape does not have that hierarchy built in. So, for example, when Christ even says, love each other to his disciples, the word agape is used. Similarly, when the disciples are loving Christ, the word agape is used, or when Christ is loving the disciples, the word agape is used. So there is a bit of a difference in the language that is important to understand. So let me come back here then here. He who has my commandments and obeys them, he it is that loves me, and he that loves me shall be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will reveal myself to him. The reason I kept putting agape in brackets, if you introduce bhakti there from Krishna to Arjuna, it will be completely wrong, because of this built-in hierarchy. But the man who loves his self loses it, while the man who hates his self in this world preserves it to life eternal. Sometimes I wonder whether these strong words like hating his self is really helpful. It's much more to be free of it, to be more and more not getting wholly stuck with it. But these are the translations, and one is just to stuck with it. But the point to be made here again and again, it's a very common tendency to say that Christ's love is unconditional. He loves everybody. Sounds very nice. But just read this again carefully. He loves only those who obey his commandments. And this kind of remark of his is repeated several times by him, particularly in John's Gospel. I may come back to this again, so look at it carefully. And he that loves me shall be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will reveal myself to him. Strictly speaking, if I say I love God, or I love Krishna, or I love Christ, what the hell do I know about God? I've read something, I've heard something, I imagine something, and guaranteedly I would love God so that I can get to heaven or find something, right? So always something comes from my own acquiring something. Therefore, the always very suggestion, you'll find similar remarks very strongly expressed by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita when we come to this next time, that it's not a question of my loving Christ, much more importantly to be loved by Christ. And why would he bother to love me? As he says, if I obey his commandments. And Krishna says exactly that. I will show you in the Bhagavad Gita next time. Now, this particular quote I have mentioned several times here. Whoever is without love does not know God, for God is love. God is love, and whoever remains in love remains in God, and God in him. Again, a simple reminder, this is different from saying God is loving. That will be a characteristic of God. But to say God is love is the very structure of God. It has no other meaning. In fact, 3 or 4 other words get used. Truth, love, beauty, consciousness. This is really more or less describing the very structure of whatever we mean by God. And then Christ's remark, the Father and I are one, even though he was condemned for this by the people around. What does it mean? If he is one with the Father, love will naturally ooze out of him. Being one with the Father simply means being one with God, and if God is love, truth, these things will naturally ooze out of him. This is actually, maybe some of you have heard me say that earlier, Krishnamurti in contemporary times, more than anybody else, at least in my readings or understanding, very much used to emphasize not to go around trying to do good, because if you're trying to do good, you're always wishing to acquire some benefit from it. He would repeatedly say, if there is goodness in you, it will ooze out of you. I think maybe I had already mentioned, this is actually a report given by Laura Huxley, Aldous Huxley's second wife. In one evening, they were gathered there among 5 or 6 people, and Krishnamurti was there also. Good. So Krishnamurti intervened. He said, you shouldn't be going around doing good. They were surprised by this. They said, but you're going around the world doing good. He said, not intentionally. For him, if there is goodness in you, it will ooze out of you. In fact, more than once I have heard him use this particular remark. A rose does not decide to smell like a rose. We recognize the rose from its fragrance. So if you have goodness or love in you, so that this is the reason I'm quoting here this remark from John's Gospel. If Christ is one with God and God is love, love naturally oozes out of him. It's not a question of him deciding to start loving people. And as I think I have said this earlier as well, so many of Christ have the word love in them. I don't know any other religious literature which has that kind of repeated emphasis on love. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Is it possible, I don't know, it's just a thought that came to me as you had put the slide up. Could neighbor possibly be the personality? Do you know, because we have this higher consciousness, we have this aspect of ourselves that is able to see things deeper, to feel that deeper love. But then there's the personality that is very caught up with the ephemeral and the transitory, you know,
Yes.
and we can come to a point where we really don't like that.
I think you're a little bit more or less taking some of the remarks I was about to make in a few minutes. It's slightly different commandment, but it's a good idea. That, for example, when he speaks about loving your enemies, there I try to make exactly this point, that we have two in us, according to all spiritual teachings. It gets expressed in varieties of ways. For example, St. Paul refers to them as spiritual nature and carnal nature. Plotinus refers to them as higher nature, lower nature. Krishna refers to them as divine nature and demonic nature. My own teacher, Jean de Salzman, used to call them angelic nature and animal nature. So you see this capital S self and the small s self. So these two. So I think you're quite right. I was going to say when it comes to he says, love your enemy, invitation is exactly not to be against your lower self either. Otherwise it gets, unless you hate yourself, which was a previous remark here. Similarly, in this question of if I can take care of this lower self, because lower self, as I have more than once said already, but some of you are here for the first time, from all spiritual teachings, a particle of divinity or particle of spirit, which we end up calling the soul, that is the what that takes on my body, including the mind. And why does it take it on? Because it wants the body and mind to be a proper instrument in order to act rightly, so it can assist the evolution of this particle of divinity, ultimately to come back home, come back to God. Maybe in human history, perhaps a dozen people may have come to that level, but that's a different matter. But that's the call. So, in a way, this distinction, first of all, to realize that there are two in me, easier to say capital S self and small s self, but we don't have that advantage in the Devanagari script in which the Sanskrit is written or Hindi is written. So there it has to be taken in the context. But in English, or actually in most of the European languages, there is an uppercase and a lowercase. So it's easier there.
But unlike the rose, it doesn't have,
Say that again?
unlike the rose, which
Yeah.
its effervescence is its effervescence, it
Yes.
does not have a smaller or capital S. So the practice has to come in somewhere. We just are not, we just aren't.
You know, I'm having difficulty hearing you, so I'm just going to put my hearing aid there.
We use the analogy of the rose and
Yes.
its effervescence, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have that luxury. So there has to be a practice between the small s and the capital S, right?
But even to begin to recognize that there are two in me, not just to easily accept this, because sometimes, I must say, at least in my case, I'm sometimes actually surprised that I'm unusually compassionate. Very uncommon for me, but or even willing to undertake some kind of service. Whereas generally I'm self-occupied. What do I gain from this, etc. But if I begin to even understand that the other self, now we can call it a capital S self, also exists. Maybe it needs to be cultivated, it needs to be nourished. I need to attend to this more frequently. All that may be so.
Well, that was my point, like with Aldous Huxley.
Yes.
Maybe they were practicing.
Yes, yes. No, actually, most of his, in any case, as you will soon see, he says to his disciples, you didn't choose me, I chose you. I often remind people forget this. They keep thinking it's all very unconditional. 100 people can apply for a Nobel Prize. Somebody has to decide who is going to get it. So it's not a question of everything coming from my side. So we'll come back to this in a few moments. Let me just come back here. Here, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your heavenly Father. For he makes his sun rise on the bad and the good, and causes rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Be perfect just as your heavenly Father is perfect. See the call? Now again, anybody who claims or wishes even, not a question of just claiming to be a Christian or a follower of Christ, or even just wishing to be so, need to ask, do I love my enemies? There are 3 billion Christians. Are they all loving their enemies? So one has to question this, but more applying it to oneself. And this is where I'm coming back to what Ananya had said in a previous context. in my judgment, what is really being also addressed here is the very aspect of me, if you like, the lower self, that is interfering with the journey of the higher self. In that sense, it becomes an opposition, an enemy. How can I take that also into account? That's at least the way I would personally understand this. Because there are other incidents mentioned in other Gospels that first of all Christ forgave the sinner, then they repented. It's not that they first repented and then he forgave them, but he first forgave them, then they repented. Now here I want to take another slight note. The word which is almost always translated in the Bible as repent, and there is always this call and recognize that you are a sinner and you have to repent. The Greek word is metanoia, which literally means to make a 180-degree turn, to change, to make a change. And maybe I should take another remark here too. The word which is translated as sin is amartya, written with an H, but H is not pronounced. So it may sound like hamartya, but H is generally not pronounced in Greek. Literally what that means is missing the mark. So if I feel or think or even imagine that I have a mark in my life, I have a goal or my aim, and if I am not connected with it, if I am missing it, that is the sin. But what has been made into a whole rigmarole of a sin. So these two words are very significant, and it's useful to come back to their Greek origin, because every book in the New Testament was first written in Greek, and then it is translated into Latin, English, etc. So amartya literally means to miss the mark, and metanoia to make a 100-degree turn. Or to change one's course, if you like, whichever. Then this is a particularly difficult commandment. By the way, this commandment is given by him only to the disciples. The other ones he was speaking even in general, publicly. This is only for the disciple. I give you a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. So you also should love one another. This is how all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Sometimes I really wonder who among the whole of 8 billion people is possibly able to follow really any of this. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. It was not you who chose me, but I who chose you, and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. This I command you: love one another. This is really important for any searcher to actually ask oneself. Would I be accepted by a slightly higher level of searchers or teachers or gurus? Why not? Now, in a way, I often feel that I don't actually know this, but I imagine that perhaps 100,000 people heard Christ in Jerusalem. How many followed him? Probably 12. And then how many did he actually accept as disciples? Probably a dozen. So it's all very nice to say, I am a Christian or I am a follower of Christ. But will he accept me? And he even says, why would he accept me unless I obey his commandments? Christ's love is, there is a very great tendency to say it's unconditional, I'm just being loved by Christ, etc. Or even that God is unconditionally loving me. But Christ's love is based on awareness and knowledge and is never sentimental or in reaction to like or dislike. It is compassionate but hard-headed. Here is a remark. Whoever I love, I reprove and chastise. Be in earnest, then and turn. I literally, if you read the usual translations, it would say, and repent, which in my judgment is just getting carried away with certain expression. Literally, the Greek translation there is to turn around. That's why I changed this. But you can look it up. All the translations in English would use the word repent. This is one of the reasons I often recommend to people that if you are seriously interested in any text, do look at some of the key words in the original language in which that text was written. This is the reason, for example, in my writing about the Yoga Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita, at the end, I give about 30 Sanskrit words, and they can have many different meanings. And so to just even to know about a dozen or about 20 key words in Greek, then reading the Bible translations can be much more helpful than just simply reading the translations. Similarly, in the Bhagavad Gita, to know about 20 Sanskrit words, the root words. Again, a reminder that I think yesterday I had given this example. The sun may be shining, if you like, unconditionally, but if I have the curtains drawn or the doors closed, I can't receive the sunlight. So something is required from my side, even if we may say, perhaps quite rightly, that love is just oozing out of Christ. It's not that he's deciding not to love. That may be so, but am I receptive? And in this context, I was going to mention to you a remark actually of our great scientist, Albert Einstein. He was periodically asked, on one particular occasion he responded to this, so the question was asked in a slightly different language. The question was, is creativity a matter of chance rather than saying matter of grace? They would say, is it a matter of chance or is it a matter of hard work? And I think his response is rather very interesting. What he said, this is Einstein, ultimately creativity is a matter of chance, but chance seems to favor the prepared. The reason I am bringing it here is the sun may be shining, but am I prepared to see the sun, or my curtains are drawn? So something is required from our side, even though one could say quite happily that the sun is shining quite unconditionally. This was actually one of my continuing argument, may not be the right word, but periodically conversation with Krishnamurti, because he was somehow so gung-ho about saying nothing needs to be done from our side. In fact, one of his remarks is, be totally attentive and do nothing. And I kept saying that how can it be that this is why I use that particular example, that the sun may be shining, but if I don't open the curtain, how the hell am I going to see it? So it's not that I'm making the sun to shine. I don't need to do that. I cannot do that. But always there was very strong suggestion from him. This is why he ends up saying there is no way from here to there. You know, truth is a pathless land. Well, if I'm not going on any damn path, I don't know how I can get to the truth. So I had constant arguments with him about this. But these are some of his remarks.
Ravi,
But,
over here.
yes.
That reminds me of a story that he tells when he's working with some of his closest associates, Krishnamurti, and talking about welcoming an inquirer into their center for a retreat. And he says that the man will be left alone all day long to do the work that needs to be done on himself. That is, constantly being aware of what's going on within himself and around and all. And he says at the end of the day, he will be exhausted
Yes.
with this effort and will probably just need to listen to some quiet music in the evening. So he knew full well
Yeah.
the energy that it takes to be constantly aware
Yeah.
in the way that he had suggested.
No, that is true, but he would repeatedly say,
I know, that was him.
there is no path, etc. And then at a sort of a usual level, it gets misunderstood that I don't need to try anything. You know? It is also true that some people with quite subtle intelligence heard him. They didn't misunderstand these things. So all this is true, but a general kind of remarks like this can carry on, and as if nothing needs to be done from my side. Now, personally, for me, my understanding is actually very strongly expressed in Shvetashvatar Upanishad. There is a great Upanishad named after the sage, Shvetashvatar, where he makes this remark that all human realization is a subtle combination of human effort. If you're interested in the Sanskrit, what is tapas prabhav? And benediction of the devas. So it's a very subtle combination of the two. And I think that makes at least much more common sense to me, at least in my own understanding. I can't do anything? Have you forbidden me to do something?
Try it one more time, maybe, too.
On one occasion, Krishnamurti turned to me going for a walk. I was very fortunate actually to go with him many, many times. And suddenly he says, I have no idea what even prompted him to say that. Sir, never take a public speaking course. It had never crossed my mind to take a public speaking course. Why would he turn to me and say, sir, never take a... I was so surprised by his remark.
Did he tell you why?
Hmm?
Did he tell you why he said that?
No, you know, one of the things which I understood fairly early on, one can have sometimes what we call a conversation, but it's not going back and forth so much. Often one just needs to hear something and then another issue comes up, another topic comes up. Depends on the person you're communicating with. Can I go forward now?
You just tell me and I'll advance it for you.
Hmm?
I think your battery died, so if you just tell me when you want the next slide,
Oh, it's-
I can do
Yeah,
it for you.
sooner or later I discovered the problem is always with me.
And now we're supposed to protest, right?
That's right.
It has a closed type. Click it in the back.
Point it right here. You working? Yeah, there you go. So you missed, you go back.
Hmm?
I think you're one too far. So that was your last one, this is your next one.
this is another remark of Christ, whoever keeps the commandments that he has from me is the man who loves me, and the man who loves me will be loved by my Father, and shall love him, and I shall love him and reveal myself to him. Almost exactly a similar remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. That if he loves me, then he will reveal himself to me. But why would he love me? If I obey his commandments. This is always a repeated reference. So to just imagine that it is just unconditional, I don't have to do anything, he just loves me. It's all very nice. Here, this is almost repeating much the same. Whoever loves me will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our dwelling with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words, yet the word you hear is not mine, but that of the Father who sent me. This is actually a repeated reference, not in the remarks, only the remarks of Christ, but all the great teachers. How can I become an instrument of the will of God or Krishna, rather than that it's me doing something? In fact, I quoted yesterday from the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna saying, an advanced yogi realizes that I do nothing at all. I'm not doing it because my doing almost always has some implication of what I will get from it, what I'll gain from it. But to actually become an instrument of Krishna's will allows for me to hear, to understand what can possibly be done through me or by me, and allow myself to become an instrument of this. It was in that context also I quoted something that you like very much from, this is a Chinese from the Chinese tradition, a great text. A sage does nothing, but nothing is left undone. You were raising your hand, yeah.
I was raising my hand because that felt to me like Krishnamurti, that's Krishnamurti's kind of not doing.
Yes, no, I agree. In a way, he's actually, if we seriously understand when he says be totally attentive and do nothing, that I don't try to do something. If I'm totally attentive, whatever is required will come through me. No, I agree. But the question really, how delicate these words are, and made in public, thousands of people are hearing him. In fact, my one of these Ojai journals, which is lying on my desk there in my room, says more people have listened to Krishnamurti than to anybody else in the world. He's going. I don't know whether it is true, but that's the remark in that journal.
Really?
Yeah. It's lying in my room there, and.
Ravi, something that may not be that well known is Krishnamurti would meditate for sometimes up to 6 hours a day.
Yes.
Well, that's not common.
Yes. And also he was really very, very interested in going for walks in nature. And sometimes even in a public talk, there may be hundreds of people that say, oh, listen to the birds. Look at the tree. Absolutely in the middle of the talk he would come sometimes with this. So always really returning to direct perception rather than what I have read or what I have heard, quoting something. This is in fact, repeatedly I have said, that this is what makes a true sage. They're not just quoting something or believing something, they say what they see. And yesterday I had mentioned this on another occasion. Just quite incidentally, I said to Krishnamurti, sir, what do you think of this? He said, the speaker doesn't think, he just looks. Now that's the point he's trying to make. Sometimes he referred to himself as the speaker, or sometimes as K. Both of these were common expressions. Yeah.
I have a question, Raviji, because it's so hard for me, well, coming from a Hindu background but having studied religions, there have been so many translations of the Bible,
and so much oppression by the church, and things taken out, things put in, and so it's difficult to sort of read in English what a translation is from a verse, when English is probably the least descriptive and the most base in some ways of languages in terms of description. And I wonder, like for me, I'm more attracted to the Gnostic Bible, the Gnostic verses, and the Nag Hammadi and Gnostic Christianity, because I feel it's closer in line with who Christ was, as I understand, this great ascended master who just preached love. And so I wonder, like, how is it possible with the Bible and so many incarnations of the Bible, excuse the pun, we're relying on people, we're believing this verbatim or reading it verbatim, like a lot of Christians do, but how many of us remember exact conversations we had with our best friend decades ago? And somehow that's been transcribed as an exact conversation and it's verbatim, but don't we have to also look into the veracity of conversations remembered decades later that have changed throughout time, that are now in a language that is not very close to the original language?
No, I think what you're raising is a very important perspective. Still, the same texts are also read by some absolutely remarkable Christian sages, such as John of the Cross or Meister Eckhart or Teresa of Avila. So it is true that according to the scholar, I'm really not a scholar of Christianity. I was just very interested in John's Gospel, so I wrestled with that, and I ended up writing a book on that. But I am not, in any sense, you would call it scholar of Christian tradition. But according to the scholars, which I also end up reading, this is a requirement, the first book that was published under the category of the Bible was about 95 years later after the death of Christ.
Right.
So what you are saying is absolutely right, that it is, and then it's also, none of those Gospels are said to be written directly by the disciples of Christ. On the other hand, that the disciples have said something to their disciples, and 3 or 4 generations later, it's maybe being written down. So it is absolutely right what you're implying, that not to get so stuck on this word or that word, particularly if you have that interest. I don't highly recommend this. Scholars have to just keep arguing with each other. This is how they keep their jobs. But on the other hand, part of their job really is to say, well, this part was not part of the gospel. For example, in John's Gospel, the first chapter, where it begins by saying, in the beginning was the Word was God, which is very highly regarded chapter, almost all the Christian scholars agreed that that chapter was not there originally in John's Gospel. It was added later on. So it is true that there, from a scholarly point of view, everything that you said is quite right, that there are questionable items, and then within the Gospels there is much variation. For example, in John's Gospel there is absolutely no reference to where he was born, who his mother was or father was, etc., etc. Other Gospels refer to this. And also, even within the Christian tradition, since the 2nd century onwards particularly, John's Gospel has been regarded as the most spiritual Gospel, because it doesn't talk about any kind of temporal ideas, when he was born, where he was born, or where he died, etc. He's not concerned with this. He's just concerned with the spiritual teaching. And 2 of the greatest miracles attributed to Christ, for example, bringing Lazarus from death to life, what could be a greater miracle than that? The other one is not so great, but turning water into wine. These 2 miracles are mentioned only in one Gospel, not in all the Gospels. So you see, so the other writers are not aware of this. So in a way, what you're saying is quite right, that not to get so occupied with these, get so stuck with each of the words. On the other hand, that's what evangelical Christians every year spend billions of dollars trying to prove all other religions are stupid, they are wrong, and Christianity is the only way they can get you to heaven, etc. Billions of dollars every year are spent by them. So, everybody here in USA particularly, before election wants to have their picture taken in front of a church. Otherwise, how often was Trump going to church? He read the Bible, he could hold it upside down or not know what the difference is.
He probably read it upside down.
So one needs to be very careful about all this.
Ravi, this whole thing about doing nothing, it just seems to me you do arrive at that place, but there's the awareness that is required to get you to that place of surrender and all of your stuff on top, so that you can have that receptivity to the divine channel upon which you sit and just receive, and it comes through you, and anytime you try to do something, then it gets in the way of that. But that is almost like the absolute experience rather than the process to get there.
No, but once, if you are really informed by something subtle, then your actions carry that out, not that you are asserting yourself.
Right.
But let me, the time is actually running out here, but one of the reasons I also especially wanted to keep emphasizing this, if a father or a mother says to a child, I love you, surely it has different implications than a child saying to the father, I love you. Or we don't see the obviously different implications. If a father or mother is saying it, they have to take care of enough food for the child, enough place for education, for staying, living somewhere or the. But when a son says, maybe he's just had some nice cookies, he says, oh Dad, I love you. But he's not taking care of the father, he's not providing money for. You see what I'm saying? So one needs to be very careful when we use this expression. If a disciple says to Christ, I love you, it has completely different meaning than if Christ says to the disciple, I love you. So it's, some of these things are really so obvious in a way, but somehow it's very easy to say, I love God, I love Christ. Then I just want to move on a little bit here. Do we still have a few minutes anyway? Christ said, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven. This is not my remark, but only those who do the will of my heavenly Father. You will dwell in my love if you keep my commandments, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and dwell in his love. You can read all the canonical Gospels or non-canonical Gospels. Nowhere Christ says, I love God. There is one little exception that I'll speak about in a moment. Everywhere he says, I obey God. Which is what he is inviting the disciples or other followers to do. Not to say that I love Christ, but do I obey his commandments? And so this distinction is very important to really understand. And the word obey or obedience, etc., have now become very unacceptable. But let me remind you, the word obedience comes from ob-odir, having heard. Personally, in my own experience, I can tell you, there were many times I had conversation with Krishnamurti, but on only a few occasions I could say that I actually heard him. But when I actually heard him, there was not a question of arguing with him. I was quite happy to, if you like, obey what he was saying. And much more I felt that with Jean de Salzman, my teacher, what she said was heard by me, and I have no recollection of ever arguing with her about any of this. I had at least 100 meetings with her. So I'm simply pointing out that the words like obedience, etc., have slightly different meaning behind them, but it has now become completely unacceptable. You know, I am a big boss, I command you to do something, you must obey me, otherwise you'll be fired. So it's a whole different meaning. Now, here I want to remind you that so strong emphasis in all spiritual teachings about God is love, truth, consciousness, joy, etc., particularly emphasized in the Indian tradition the word Anand. Anand is difficult to translate in one word in English, but it could be happiness, could be joy, could be delight. Bliss. Yeah, you see, so many and one of the, relatively speaking, contemporary sage, not alive anymore, in the 20th century, Ravindra made this remark: delight created the universe for delight. It's one of my favorite remarks of Ravindra. Delight created the universe for delight. But there, in the Indian tradition, very strong emphasis that all levels of delight or pleasure need to be included, including sexual pleasure. In fact, one of the Upanishads, Aitreya Upanishad, you can look at it, begins by saying, first level of ananda is when a strong young man is in close embrace with his beloved. That's one unit of ananda. Then goes on saying, when ultimately going through hundreds of steps, when he truly knows himself, that is real ananda. So you would see in many Hindu temples, and this is the reason I'm now showing you. This is Khajuraho temple. Here is the lower story of the temple. If you ever see this in any Christian monastery, I'll give you a ticket to fly to heaven. But in many, many old Hindu temples, particularly before the arrival of the British, because British don't like sex, you will see at the lower stories of the temples images like this. But then above stories don't have these images. But sexual pleasure, why be against this? In fact, a very well-known scholar in France has written a book, What was the major effect of British rule in India? According to him, the major effect was the change to the attitude towards sex. According to this scholar, that somehow now Indians also feel uneasy about all this. That has been the major shift. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because of the famous book in the Bible called the Song of Songs, the Canticle of Canticles, or the Song of Solomon. These are the various labels for it. This is one of the quotations from there. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. If you haven't read that book, by the way, I invite you to look at it. This is part of the Bible. And many, many people, including Martin Luther, wanted that book to be taken out of the canonical Bible. And at present times, the Southern Baptist churches, they want this to be taken out of the Bible. On the other hand, well, let me just read it here. Obviously, what this song evokes depends on the quality of being of the listener. Rabbi Akiva is referred to in the Talmud as the Roshal Hakmin, which means the chief of the sages. He was executed by the Romans, whom he defied by teaching Torah in public. But this is his remark. He said, all of eternity in its entirety is not as worthy as the day on which Song of Songs was given to Israel. For all the writings are holy, but Song of Songs is the holy of holies. This is not my remark. Rabbi Akiva, regarded as one of the greatest sages in the Jewish tradition. And I think I mentioned this yesterday in a conversation with Krishnamurti. He said to me this was his most favorite book in the Bible. But soon after he said, I haven't read your Bible. So don't accuse him for any kind of consistency. What is the constant call in the spiritual teachings? As I mentioned here, not different sights, but different sight. Not different visions, but different eyes. Here is a remark of Plotinus from his great text Enneads. Similar remark in Mandukya Upanishad. To any vision must be brought an eye adapted to what is to be seen and having some likeness to it. Never did I see the sun unless it had first become sun-like. And never can the soul have vision of the first beauty unless itself be beautiful. Constant reminder that for whatever I mean by Ravi, if Ravi is going to connect with or relate with or see or hear something subtle, first of all, Ravi himself has to become a little subtler, to be refined, to be purified, to be cleansed. Different phrases are used, so don't get attached to one expression or the other. And as I said, this is also in the Mandukya Upanishad, more or less an exact translation of what Plotinus said here. Spiritual development consists in a progressive cleansing of the organs of perception. The eyes of flesh see the things of flesh, the eyes of the spirit, the things of the spirit. Here is a remark of St. Paul in Romans. For they that are according to flesh mind the things of the flesh, and they that are according to spirit, the things of the spirit. And however refined our telescopes or microscopes may become, they remain organs of flesh, not organs of spirit. Occasionally we have heard actually some astronaut, having been in the outer space, says, I didn't see angels. So should we dismiss Christ? Should we dismiss William Blake? Or even I remember in a walk with Krishnamurti, suddenly he stopped at a little pool. He said, listen how they sing. I'm not listening anything. I can't hear a damn thing, but he's hearing something. Listen how they sing. So now, these are my words, not his. Could be that he's hearing some fairies sing something. He didn't use any. But if I asked him, this was one of the things I learned very quickly. With all the sages, you don't pursue something in a direction. It has to, you just listen and then move on to something else. So I didn't question him about this, but this was his remark. So I'm simply making this remark that subtler eyes can see subtler things. Christ repeatedly says, practically in all the Gospels, you have eyes but you do not see. You have ears but you do not hear. What is he meaning by this? So one has to be very careful about dismissing something because I don't see the angels, so the angels don't exist. I think we need to take a 15 minutes break. If you don't mind, would you allow me to continue a little later on? Because I just realized I have done only halfway gone through my... Okay. Some of you may have practiced so-called vipassana meditation. You know, vipassana comes from the Sanskrit word vipashyana, to see clearly. That's the whole purpose of this meditation, to be able to see clearly what is going on inside you. So people don't really... I think the Song of Songs, as I just quoted to you, the general remark, even wanting to have it removed from the Bible by Martin Luther, and then one of the greatest rabbis' remark about this. Generally, this Song of Songs in the Jewish tradition is considered as a very intimate relationship between God and Israel. And in the Christian tradition, it is understood as a relationship between God and the church. Interesting. Here I even say personally for me personally, the Canticle of Canticles expresses the intimate, therefore sexually expressed, relationship between the mysterious one, can be labeled God, Krishna, bridegroom, lover, and the spiritual element in me, spiritual soul, Radha, bride, beloved. They have been intimately together in love and have been separated and pine for each other. If your soul is not pining for God, all this love relationship makes no sense. The daughters of Jerusalem are all the feelings and thoughts that the soul is surrounded by and is frequently taken over. That's my understanding. But here is another quote from the Song of Songs. By night on my bed I sought him whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. I will rise now and go about the city in the streets, and in the broad ways I will seek him whom my soul loveth. I sought him, but I found him not. The watchmen that go about the city found me, to whom I said, Saw ye him whom my soul loveth? It was but a little that I passed from them, but I found him whom my soul loveth. I held him and would not let him go. This is in the Song of Songs. Well, maybe before that even, but let me just a few remarks. Song of Songs is Hebrew love poetry that depicts the beauty and mystery of sexual love, one of God's gift to humanity. So in a way, it always surprises me. People get so against it. None of us will exist here without somebody having sex. So I keep reminding people there is no reason to become against this, to try to understand the intimacy of this. So the song works on two levels. It is celebrating humans' desire for intimacy and pointing to humanity's ultimate purpose, to be united with God and His wisdom. For any union to take place, both activity and receptivity are needed. Traditionally, they are associated with masculine and feminine genders. Activity with masculine gender and receptivity with feminine gender. Just really simply to do with the genitalia. This is the traditional attitude or traditional language. In the Abrahamic religious tradition, God initiates the activity and summons a prophet to act on his behalf. It is, let me just invite you to consider, it's very unusual to find in the whole Abrahamic tradition, by which I mean what gets called Judaism, Christianity, as well as Islam, where they indicate that somebody was searching for something. For example, in the Indian tradition, you can read this about Raman in contemporary times, or about Vivekananda, but in olden times. Buddha, he's struck by seeing an old man and a dead man, and then wonders, does anything survive after death? So then he sets out searching, gives up he was a prince, gives up his possibility of becoming the king. He's married, has a son, He leaves his family, but he's searching. And then gradually he comes to some understanding. But that kind of idea that somebody is searching is not very often indicated in the whole Abrahamic tradition. There always the initiative is by God. God, for example, shows to ask Moses to do something. Moses wasn't searching for anything. In fact, as I said, he's running away from the law. He goes and works with a farmer, quite understandably falls in love with the daughter of the farmer, so he's just continuing there. But there is no reference to that he's searching for something. Or any of the other prophets. Do you ever hear anybody say that Christ was searching for something? It's always the idea is that God takes the initiative. In my judgment, that is the reason, although none of my scholarly friends ever think about it, why is God called Father in the Abrahamic tradition? Why not Mother? Or why not some neuter gender? My impression is the reason for that is that the initiative is taken by God. So He's taking the activity, and then He can call a prophet or even hold a prophet by the scruff of the neck, and the prophet has no choice. They have to obey. But it's a very different perspective. So God is called Father, and so all I'm really therefore naturally masculine. And then for God, the initiator of activity is always referred to as the Father, definitely masculine, and those who wish to be united with Him need to bring receptivity, the feminine attitude. It is always easier to get stuck on surface understanding rather than to search for the deeper meaning. Literal interpretations of scriptures or the teachings of the sages result from understanding spiritual realities merely materially, not spiritually. Always a bit of this is a constant call to search something spiritually rather than simply materially. We have an incident like this in this history of India. Some of you would know we had a very great poet in the 16th century called Meera. In fact, her poetry was the most favorite poetry of Mahatma Gandhi, as an example. Yours too?
Mirabai.
Yeah, Mirabai is often the expression here. Although she was married to a prince who became then the king, but she always felt that she was married to Krishna. And even her husband seemed to somehow finally recognize this and acknowledge this. On one occasion, a very well-known yogi, this was used to be a common practice in India, and even now in rural areas it is still true, not in big urban areas, it's impossible. So these yogis will be wandering around and they will stay somewhere outside the village, and then people can come to them, bring something to eat, etc. Or they might even come to the village to beg for something. And so one very famous yogi came and was outside the village. So Meera heard about him and wanted to see him. So yogi says, but no, I'm not going to see any female. Meera said to him, or wrote back to him, "Oh yogi, I would have thought in the presence of Krishna we are all females." And the yogi was really so struck by this, he came running and adopted Meera as his teacher. This is the story from the 16th century. But the reason I'm mentioning this, that this notion is very strong, that initiative or activity or finally any kind of wisdom or understanding comes from the other side, if you like, from the divine side. And what is required from our side is receptivity. So traditionally it would have been called male and female. So that Meera's remark that I should have thought that all the disciples of Krishna are females is very relevant here. And I may also make another remark here. Very strong tendency in some literature, Song of Songs is one example of this. In the Indian literature, if you are familiar with this, Geet Govind. Geet Govind actually it was a book written in the 12th century, and the king then insisted that every night some verses from that book have to be recited. So for the last 9 centuries or more than 12 centuries now, it's been every evening it has been recited. And that book is actually, most of the Indian dancing that you see are based actually in the stories from that book, Jayadev. And that was written by an author called Jayadev. And there he describes Radha as the beloved. Ultimately, Radha is actually riding Krishna. But when it came to writing that, he could not bring himself to write this. So he just left the manuscript and went to the river Ganga. And the story is, or mythology is, that Krishna came and completed the book, in which Radha is ultimately riding Krishna. The reason I'm saying this, that there is a very strong manifestations in, if you like, what would be called sexual language, trying to indicate the intimacy between our soul and God. And therefore then it becomes bride and bridegroom in one way or the other. And then when it gets expressed, some people get a little upset. It's too sexy. And Song of Songs is an example of that here. By the way, if you're interested, my own first Sanskrit teacher was Barbara Stoller Miller at Columbia University. She has done a very good translation of this book, Gita Govinda. And the title is, she did this in 1977, Love Song of the Dark Lord. That's the title of the book. Love Song of the Dark Lord is referring to Krishna. And another remark I want to make here, you can sometimes see this in your own, if you sit for half an hour in meditation, you can watch these 3 stages there. But generally in the journey of a spiritual searcher, there are 3 main stages. First, like that of a warrior, sitting quietly, finding the right cushion, turning the lights off, or whatever is required, like a warrior preparing things. Next stage is that of a lover. You are no longer, doesn't matter where you sit. Raman Maharshi would be a good example. If you see him sitting, his terrible posture. but there is just a natural love for something. All this business of being a warrior, I sometimes say, when the warrior has finally found the girl, it'll be stupid for him to be still wearing all kinds of fancy clothing. It's time now to be simply a lover. Third stage, which is uncommon, but I hope some of you have occasionally experienced, is that of a beloved. You're no longer searching, you're no longer trying to reach something, but you are being touched, you are being contacted, you are being loved. I invite you to seriously think, if maybe next time you sit in meditation or any kind of serious search, even doing work in physics, you would find this, that one goes through these stages. Initially one is arguing with this person, that equation, that sooner or later it just seems kind of obvious, this is what I need to do. One is just loving it. And then one is surprised that something is revealed to me. I didn't know that I knew that. I quoted to you earlier from Einstein, that, but the unknown seems to favor the prepared. But if I'm not prepared, then it won't come and touch me, to reveal to me. Because, for example, in the theory, when the theory of relativity was proposed by Einstein, the relevant data was actually available to about a dozen well-known scientists, well-known physicists. But they didn't come up with that theory as he did. Why should one person come up with it and not the other 11 who have the same data? I invite you to consider these. Then I think I have a remark here from Prophet Isaiah. God, in that particular remark, he compares God to the bridegroom and his people to the bride. For, this is a direct quote, for as a young man marrieth a virgin, so shall thy sons marry thee. And as the bridegroom rejoiceth over the bride, so shall thy God rejoice over thee. This is Prophet Isaiah. Most of my Christian friends actually haven't read the Bible, as far as I know. It always surprises me. And now, John of the Cross, first of all, I should make some remarks about him. He was born in 1542 and died in 1591. Has written only 12 poems in Spanish language, and according to at least the professors in Spanish language in my university, he is regarded as the most important poet in the Spanish language. Just only 12 poems is all he wrote. And he was incarcerated by the Catholic Church, was starved, punished. They won't let, because he was speaking, first of all, by the way, he is of Jewish origin. But he was very struck by the Teresa of Avila and became her disciple, and gradually, as it were, converted to Christianity, if you like. But he comes from the Jewish background. And then he was so highly regarded by the people around him, even though, as I said, he was incarcerated, starving, writing most of this poetry when he was hungry, actually, that after his death, different people take away different limbs of his body to keep it. This was a fairly common practice earlier also. Even some of the monks, etc., or saints were, their bodies were kept alive, or people keep their limbs, etc. And then gradually, the Catholic Church realized the importance of this character, and although he died in 1591, but in 1726, now you see how many years later, he was declared a doctor in the church. Now, I mentioned this the other day, there are thousands of saints, but there are only 36 doctors. The word doctor is related with doctrine, meaning teaching. So he was the doctor of mystical theology in the Roman Catholic Church. But as I said, he was canonized in 1726, already more than 150 years after his death, and then declared a doctor only in 1926. They've been very hesitant about his poetry, and one of the reasons is he wrote a book called A Spiritual Canticle of the Soul and the Bridegroom Christ, wrote in Spanish, but obviously I don't know Spanish. I'm giving you the English translations here. Then he says, it would be foolishness to think that the language of love and the mystical intelligence can be at all explained in words of any kind. For who can describe that which he shows to loving souls in whom he dwells? He is referring to God, obviously, here with a capital H. Who can set forth in words that which he makes them feel? And lastly, who can explain that for which they long? Assuredly, no one can do it, not even they themselves who experience it. That is the reason why they use figures of spatial comparisons and similitudes. They hide somewhat of that which they feel, and in the abundance of the Spirit utter secret mysteries rather than express themselves in clear words. That this just can't be expressed in clear words is really, in a way, quite obvious, but here is a remark of the doctor of mystical theology. And if these similitudes are not received in the simplicity of a loving mind and in the sense in which they are uttered, they will seem to be effusions of folly rather than the language of reason, as anyone may see in the divine Canticle of Solomon and in others of the sacred books, wherein the Holy Spirit, because ordinary and common speech could not convey his meaning, uttered his mysteries in strange terms and similitudes. It follows from this that after all that the holy doctors have said and may say, no words of their own can explain it, nor can words do it, and so in general all that is said falls far short of their meaning. I highly recommend this book to you if you're interested in it. We must remember that the Word, the Son of God, together with the Father and the Holy Spirit, is hidden in essence and in presence, in the inmost being of the soul. That soul, therefore, that will find Him must go out from all things in will and affection and enter into the profoundest self-recollection, and all things must be to it as if they existed not. Hence, St. Augustine says, he's quoting St. Augustine, I found you not without, O Lord, I sought you without in vain, for you are within. No spiritual teacher could possibly disagree with this. There is always a great tendency to pray as if I'm looking up, God is up there. In the whole Abrahamic tradition, you never see any posture of meditation. It's always posture of prayer. Which is why then periodically somebody has to remind that what is required is to look within. That's where God is, not over there. So this is a remark of St. Augustine, which John of the Cross is simply repeating that remark. God is therefore hidden within the soul, and the true contemplative will seek Him there in love, saying, where have you hidden yourself? Then he writes his own spiritual canticle. This is from John of the Cross. This is not from the Canticle of Canticles. There he gave me his breast, there he taught me the science full of sweetness, and there I gave to him myself without reserve. There I promised to be his bride. That's in one of his own poems. This is from John of the Cross, not from the Song of Songs. And then he feels that he has to explain it to people so that they don't misunderstand it. So he writes about it in his book. This is what he says. There he gave me his breast. To give the breast to another is to love and cherish him and communicate one's secrets to him as a friend. The soul says here that God gave it his breast. That is, he gave it his love and communicated his secrets to it. It is thus that God deals with the soul in this state, and more too, as it appears from the words that follow. There he taught me the science full of sweetness. So he has to even explain his own poem so that they don't get misunderstood because of this actual kind of expressions that is used here. Here the soul speaks of the two contracting parties in this spiritual betrothal, itself and God. In the inner cellar of love, they both met together, God giving the soul the breasts of his love freely, whereby he instructs it in his mysteries and wisdom, and the soul also actually surrendering itself, making no reservation whatever, either in its own favor or in that of others, promising to be his forever. He's the doctor of mystical theology, let me keep reminding you. This science is mystical theology, which is the secret science of God, and which spiritual men call contemplation. It is most full of sweetness because it is knowledge by love. Love is the master of it, and it is love that renders it all so sweet. Inasmuch as this science and knowledge are communicated to the soul in that love with which God communicates himself, it is sweet to the understanding because knowledge belongs to it, and sweet to the will because it comes by love which belongs to the will. So knowledge and then will, meaning action, is brought together in love. I don't know whether I had something else from him. No. So I'm now inviting you, if you wish to, because these suggested exercises are merely really to invite you to reflect on some of these things. What would you consider are the differences in the implications of you saying, I love Christ, and Christ saying to you, I love you? What do you feel is the difference between these two expressions? Same word gets used, and one can say, I'm being unconditionally loved or whatever, but what is the meaning of these expressions? And as always, I invite you, if you're interested, that's just my book on the Gospel of John. If you have any questions, you're welcome to write to me. So, we have about almost 15 minutes. Please bring your own insights or questions. Yes?
Ravi, I've always been interested in the influence of the Essenes on Jesus Christ. The Essenes was a mystical, as you know,
Yes.
and believed in reincarnation and other things. I'm wondering if you could say a little about what that influence was.
Well, it really, first of all, part of the trouble is the churches have gone very strongly against any of these kind of notions that Christ went and learned anything from anybody. This
But
is
historically, we know
yeah.
he did.
In fact, BBC, this is the British Broadcasting Corporation, had produced a whole series of films. In one of those films, they speak very much about Christ actually going to a Buddhist monastery and learning from there, etc. But of course, the churches don't want to admit to any of this. So it's very difficult to say. But in general, my own impression is that in the usual, in the canonical gospel, or even in the non-canonical gospel, nothing is written about what Christ was doing or where he was between the ages of about 14 to 30, 12 to 30. Now, for most human beings, that's the time when they're searching for anything. So, if he is not just lying around just because he's not interested in anything, that would be very strange. And in Srinagar, in Kashmir, in India, there is a grave of Christ. Of course, it's called
Isa,
Isa.
Saint Isa.
This same thing as Jesus, it's translated, is pronounced differently, Isa. I have actually visited that grave myself in Srinagar. So there is a very strong tendency, or maybe one could even say if from certain areas or some people, very much even they mention some historical steps, that he did not actually die on the cross. He was in fact, if he is in fact the Son of God or one with God, he is able to move away from that, or may, if you like, officially so-called die, but does not actually die, and that he moved away, went towards India, etc. And that's where he finally died. And that earlier he was in a Buddhist monastery. So there have been many scholarly debates about all this, but you can guaranteedly agree that the churches are not going to admit to any of this. To imagine that Christ was taught in a Buddhist monastery, can you believe it from a church point of view? So, but maybe you want to say something more about it, specifically what has struck you from that remark that you just made.
Well, I just wondered if you knew anything about
I mean, in a way, one can read many things about all this. I have also probably read. But there are always arguments back and forth. And personally for me, one of the reasons I have sort of, what I am really more interested in for last at least a decade or so, even more, is something that I can myself directly see. What this scholar says, you can go on the internet every day, somebody is giving you a workshop how to get to nirvana. They can do that. And all the scholarly disputes They can go on forever. None of this particularly engages me. So, but I have, in the past, I also used to be a so-called scholar, read many of these things. So sometimes I can quote them, but personally I'm really not very interested in this. In fact, I said the other day, some friends of mine were surprised that for the last 1 decade I've hardly read any book, but sometimes I have people ask me to write a preface or something for their book. And if they are good friends of mine, I can hardly not do that. That's right. So then I have to do it. But usually I just don't. No, I'm done with reading. I'm much more interested in direct perception. So, but on the other hand, I have nothing against scholarship. People, they need to have good jobs. They can continue to argue. So.
I just felt a lot of the metaphysical things came from the Essenes, some people think. And there is more historical confirmation of the Essenes rather than the myth that he went to Kashmir and all that.
Or even in the non-canonical, for example, Gospel of Philip, even his male disciples, for example, one of them asks, why do you keep kissing Mary on the mouth? So then there is very strong suggestion that he was in fact not only in love with, but actually married to Mary Magdalene. But the church is not going to allow all this. And then it becomes very literal-minded, virgin birth. Even canonical gospel, like Gospel of Luke, speaks about older brothers of Christ. James is the older brother of Christ who is one of his followers. And the other people are saying, why are your own brothers not agreeing with you, etc. And then Thomas is called Thomas Didymus. Didymus literally means twin. He's, according to some scholars, he's a twin of Jesus Christ. But scholars also keep arguing with each other, so they don't all agree. So don't necessarily buy what I'm saying. But the point I'm simply trying to make, then virgin birth becomes a very literal-minded idea. But the same thing we see Nicodemus, who is a member of the very council that ultimately crucified Christ or decided to crucify him. He was the head of that council, and he comes to Christ in the middle of the night. It's a little bit, I know one cardinal who had gone to the Dalai Lama for some advice, but he has to sneak out. He can't be known to be as a cardinal going to the Dalai Lama for advice. So he goes in the middle of the night, and the very first thing he says, how can one enter the kingdom of heaven? And the Christ remark very much that you have to be born again, born from above. And this is Nicodemus, here is an intelligence person. Literally the word Nicodemus in Greek means ruler of men. That's the literal meaning of the word Nicodemus, ruler of men. And what he says, how can an old man like me re-enter the womb of his mother? Now, see the literal-mindedness about the second birth? But all of this, I'm afraid, is absolutely so common. Everything gets reduced to a very low level. And the call always is to, which is why I repeatedly keep saying the quality of the source is obviously important. Many people say many things. Why should we bother to listen to what Christ said rather than what X, Y, Z said or what the Buddha said? Because the quality of the source is important, but also depends on the quality of the receiver. Every Nazi read the same gospel as did John of the Cross. And they all read the same Song of Songs. As Martin Luther wants it to be taken out of the Bible. Rabbi Akiva is saying this is the holiest of holies. And John of the Cross is obviously so admiring it. And he's the doctor of mystical theology. So you see that same thing can be looked at so differently by people, depending on the quality of their own being. Yeah.
Ravi, I've written down 4 questions,
Oh.
and reading them through, I can distill them down to one question.
Okay.
And these are, you're saying love your neighbors, love your enemies. If you follow the commandments, you will be loved, right? so if you follow the commandments, you will be loved. And love your neighbor, and you had mentioned, could that be loving a part of yourself that perhaps is less developed or struggling, not you? And then the third one is, you had mentioned, is the lower self interfering with our spiritual development? And the fourth is, be perfect. So my question is it more advantageous, or are we taught to withhold love from those who are not following the commandments, or parts of ourselves that are perhaps less developed? Or would it be more advantageous to love and accept and support the parts of ourselves that maybe have a hard time getting up in the morning? And rather than judging that part of myself that has a hard time getting up in the morning to do my practice, or judging you because you're not doing this, that, or the other. I'm just saying, I feel, for me, cultivating more compassion and acceptance and curiosity to those parts of myself that I may be struggling with, and those parts of others that I don't necessarily agree with, rather than withholding love or just ostracizing.
No, I think what you're saying is right, at least in my understanding. But always requirement, not just simply have a theoretical idea. Loving somebody, or loving even myself, requires energy, requires time, requires consideration. So depending on how much energy you have, if you decide to just love everybody going by on the street, you're just wasting your time and energy, I can guarantee. So from a practical point of view, see what it is that you need in order to cultivate the self that somehow calls you. And if that requires for you to discipline your lower self, sometimes that may be necessary. If it calls you to just love your lower self, that may be necessary. So whatever is required. So really any of these questions, if they are actually practical questions, which is quite different from theoretical, then one can argue about this or that. But if they are practical, then one needs to see how much time or energy I have to attend to something. And if there is an energy which can allow me to attend to 10 things, fine. But if I have only attend to only one thing, then I need to choose which is the one thing that is important for me to attend. Somebody else may be able to attend to 10, that's fine. So in a way, when we make a theoretical question, then it becomes, what is the good idea? Should it be 10 people we should be loving, or one person?
Judging the parts of myself that I'm struggling with, or judging others because they are not doing what I think they should, also takes a lot of energy.
Yes.
So I guess my point is to just, there might maybe a level of acceptance, and a level of the parts that I'm trying to work on, and letting go of the attachment to agreeing or disagreeing, or loving or not loving others.
No, I agree. And I think in a way, always keep in mind, each one of us has only a limited amount of energy and limited amount of time. Question is, where do I focus that time and energy? And to take on trying to help the whole humanity or the whole world is all a wonderful idea, but do I have enough? I mean, I sometimes keep, many times I have mentioned here, even Christ, his own life, did the world really get changed by him? Or Buddha's existence, did the world get changed? Some people, without question, learned something very profound, very deep, and a great transformation took place. But for imagining, or for Christ even to imagine himself that he has come to change the whole world, in fact, I invite you to read the 17th chapter in John's Gospel. carefully, because this is sometimes called his last prayer. In my judgment, it is his report to God about his own existence. There he even says, I have taught your teaching, referring to the Father, only to those who you brought to me. I don't pray for the world. This is a direct quote from Christ. This is not my remark. I don't pray for the world. I pray only for those who you have brought to me. So but it's very fine for Christians to keep saying, well, he's doing everything, the whole world is being reformed, etc. But he himself is quite clear how much energy and time he has. And then he says, I chose you rather than you chose me. So there are certain people he has chosen who he regards as possible candidates who can learn something. And all of his disciples, about whom we know anything out of the 12, they were all in one form or the other killed or died in one way or the other. It's not that they became princes or became rich or became cardinals in the Vatican or the Pope. None of them. I mean, all this talk is just bullshit that goes on in the name of the Buddha had enormous amount of energy, but even they have a limited amount of energy and limited amount of time. So they can assist some people, but to imagine they can assist everybody and that all they need to do is to just say, you're saved. And all I have to say, I believe that. So it's just bullshit, really, I think, to be practical. I'm sorry the time is up, but we can reflect on some of these things that I'm saying. It's not a question of, don't simply believe what I say. I'm just a simple, ordinary searcher.